The Christmas of 1865 arrived at Magnolia Ridge Plantation like a ghost draped in winter mist. The war had ended 7 months prior, yet its shadow lingered over the Texas bottomlands like smoke that refused to clear. The grand house stood defiant against the December chill, its white columns gleaming in the pale afternoon light, but something had shifted in the air. The enslaved people who had worked these fields for generations now wore their bondage differently. Some had already fled north, vanishing into the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others remained, caught between the promise of freedom and the brutal reality that emancipation had changed little in the daily machinery of survival. Lydia moved through the main house kitchen with the practiced silence of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was a form of protection. At 28 years old, her hands bore the permanent stains of lye soap and wood ash, her fingernails cracked from years of scrubbing, kneading, and serving. She had been born on this plantation, delivered by her mother in a cramped cabin behind the cotton gin, and she had never known a single day beyond its borders. The Hargrove family owned her, or had owned her, though what that distinction meant in practice remained unclear. Master Edmund Hargrove had gathered the remaining enslaved workers 3 weeks after Appomattox to announce they were free to go, but in the same breath he'd explained there would be no wages, no land, no provisions for those who left. It was freedom, he said, but freedom to starve. If you're discovering this story of resistance and survival, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard around the world. Lydia had chosen to stay, not from loyalty but from calculation. She had watched 2 families attempt to leave in June, only to return hollow-eyed and defeated after finding nothing but closed doors and hostile towns beyond the plantation gates. The roads leading away from Magnolia Ridge offered no salvation, just different forms of suffering. Former Confederate soldiers roamed the countryside, angry and displaced, taking out their bitterness on any black person they encountered. The Freedmen's Bureau offices were overwhelmed and understaffed, unable to provide the 40 acres and a mule that had been promised. Towns posted signs warning that vagrants would be arrested and leased back to plantations under the convict labor system. Freedom, it turned out, was a word without substance, a promissory note written on air. At least here Lydia knew the patterns of cruelty. At least here she understood how to navigate the dangerous currents of the Hargrove household. Her mother had taught her the geography of survival before consumption took her 5 years earlier. Which floorboards creaked, which hours Mistress Caroline drank herself into stupors, which corners of the property offered brief moments of solitude. Her mother had also taught her to read, a secret education conducted by candlelight in their cabin, using a tattered Bible stolen from the main house. It was a dangerous gift, that literacy, but it had given Lydia access to a world beyond the plantation's borders, even if only in her imagination. The other enslaved workers who remained at Magnolia Ridge occupied a strange limbo. They still lived in the same cabins, still worked the same fields, still answered to the same overseers. The only difference was that Edmund Hargrove now called them employees and promised wages that never materialized. He kept a ledger of debts, for housing, for food rations, for tools and clothing, debts that somehow always exceeded any wages earned. It was slavery by another name, dressed up in the language of contracts and employment, but the chains were just as real, even if they were made of paper instead of iron. The Christmas feast was Mistress Caroline's obsession, her desperate attempt to resurrect the antebellum grandeur that had crumbled along with the Confederacy. She had spent weeks planning the menu, her voice shrill and insistent as she directed Lydia through preparations that required ingredients the plantation could barely afford. There would be roasted duck with orange glaze, sweet potato casserole crusted with pecans, cornbread dressing fragrant with sage, cranberry relish, 3 kinds of pie, and a crown roast of pork that had cost Edmund Hargrove a small fortune from a merchant in Houston. The guest list included neighboring plantation families, the Whitfields, the Beaumonts, the Caldwells, all of them clinging to the fiction that their world had not fundamentally collapsed. Caroline spoke about the feast with an almost manic intensity, as if the perfect Christmas dinner could somehow restore what had been lost. She pored over receipts from before the war, her finger tracing yellowed pages that documented banquets from another era. She wanted everything to be exactly as it had been in 1860, when Magnolia Ridge had been the jewel of Harrison County, when 30 enslaved families had worked its fields, when the cotton harvest had filled the Hargrove coffers with gold. Lydia had been cooking for 3 days straight, her feet swollen in boots that had belonged to someone else, her back screaming from hours bent over the cast-iron stove. The kitchen was an inferno of heat and steam, the windows fogged opaque, the air thick with the competing scents of roasting meat, baking bread and rendered fat. She worked alone now. The other house servants had fled, and Mistress Caroline refused to hire anyone from the remaining field workers, claiming they were too crude for the delicate work of serving her guests. So Lydia carried the entire burden herself, rising before dawn to stoke the fires, working past midnight to prepare components that would be assembled on Christmas Day. Her body ached in ways she had learned to ignore. There was the constant throb in her lower back, fair pain that had started after she'd fallen from a ladder 3 years earlier while cleaning the second-floor windows. There were her hands, perpetually chapped and raw from constant immersion in scalding water. There was the exhaustion that lived in her bones, an accumulated weariness from 28 years of labor without rest. But she had learned to separate her consciousness from her body's complaints, to exist in a kind of numb autopilot that allowed her to function despite everything. But it was in those 3 days of preparation, in the solitude of that sweltering kitchen, that something hardened inside Lydia's chest. She had endured 28 years of casual violence, the slaps that came without warning, the meals she'd prepared and never tasted, the Christmas mornings, when she'd watched the Hargrove children unwrap gifts while she received nothing but extra chores. She had bitten her tongue through countless humiliations, had perfected the art of making herself small and silent and inoffensive. Yet as she stood over that feast, basting the crown roast with herb-infused butter, something ancient and furious stirred in her blood. The catalyst came on Christmas Eve, during the final preparations. Mistress Caroline descended into the kitchen in a rustle of green silk, her face already flushed with afternoon sherry. She inspected Lydia's work with the critical eye of someone who had never cooked a meal in her life, her fingers trailing across counters, lifting pot lids, tasting sauces with a silver spoon. She immediately discarded into the washing basin. Her movements were theatrical, performative, each gesture designed to remind Lydia of the hierarchy that supposedly still governed their lives. "This gravy is too thick," Caroline announced, her voice carrying that particular pitch of displeasure that Lydia knew preceded violence. "Did I not explain exactly how I wanted it prepared? Must I supervise every single task, or can you people manage even the simplest instructions?" Lydia kept her eyes lowered, her hands still on the cutting board where she'd been mincing parsley. The gravy was perfect. She had made it hundreds of times, knew its texture and consistency by instinct. But Caroline wasn't really critiquing the food. She was reasserting dominance, reminding Lydia that emancipation had changed nothing in the emotional architecture of their relationship. "Yes, mistress, I can thin it with more stock." The slap came fast, Caroline's palm connecting with Lydia's cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. The kitchen tilted, stars bursting across Lydia's vision, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. She steadied herself against the counter, her breath coming shallow, her face burning. The parsley knife clattered to the floor, ringing against the stones. "Don't make excuses," Caroline hissed, and Lydia could smell the alcohol on her breath, sweet and medicinal. "You people were supposed to be grateful we kept you on. Grateful. Instead, you give me substandard work, and that insolent expression. I should have let you starve like the rest of them." Lydia said nothing. She had learned long ago that words in these moments only extended the punishment. She simply stood there, head bowed, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek, waiting for Caroline to exhaust herself and retreat back to the main house. The silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous, broken only by the bubbling of pots on the stove. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Caroline demanded, and Lydia slowly raised her eyes. The mistress's face was twisted with an emotion that went beyond simple anger. There was desperation there, and fear, and something that might have been grief for a world that no longer existed. "You will have this feast perfect tomorrow. Perfect. If a single dish is anything less than flawless, I will see to it that you regret the day you were born. Do you understand me?" "Yes, mistress," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible. Caroline studied her for another long moment, then turned and swept out of the kitchen, leaving behind the lingering scent of perfume and sherry. Lydia remained frozen, her hand pressed to her burning cheek, something cold and final settling in her stomach. She could hear Caroline's footsteps receding through the house, could hear the distant slam of a door, then silence, profound and absolute. She walked to the small pantry off the kitchen, to the high shelf where household supplies were kept. Her hands moved with purpose as she reached for the blue glass bottle tucked behind the flour sacks. Arsenic powder. kept for controlling the rats that plagued the plantation's grain stores. She had seen it used before, had watched old Joseph mix it with lard to create poison baits. She knew its properties from overheard conversations, knew how a small amount could cause violent illness, how a larger amount could stop a heart. The bottle was dusty, untouched for months, its label written in Edmund Hargrove's careful script. Lydia stood in that pantry for a long moment, the bottle cool in her palm, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She thought of her mother, dead from exhaustion and disease at 42, buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the cotton fields. She thought of her younger brother, sold away when he was 10 years old to settle one of Edmund Hargrove's gambling debts, his name and face now faded to ghost impressions in her memory. She thought of her father, who she had never known, rumored to be one of the Hargrove's sons who had died at Shiloh. She thought of every Christmas she had worked through, every feast she had prepared and never tasted, every moment of her life that had been owned by people who saw her as livestock with the capacity for speech. The kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle bubbling of stock on the stove. Outside, through the fogged windows, she could see the first stars emerging in the December sky, cold and distant, and indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Lydia's fingers tightened around the blue glass bottle, feeling its weight, its promise. She had crossed some invisible threshold in her mind, moved from the realm of obedience into something darker and more decisive. The slap had been nothing new. She had endured worse, far worse over the years. But something about the timing, about Caroline's words dripping with contempt while Lydia stood surrounded by the feast she had labored to create, had severed the final thread of her compliance. She thought about poison. She had heard stories whispered among the enslaved community, tales passed down through generations about resistance that took subtler forms than rebellion. There was the story of old Martha in Louisiana, who had slowly poisoned her master over months with small doses mixed into his evening whiskey, each night stealing a little more of his life until he withered away, the doctors baffled by his mysterious decline. There was the account of Samuel in Alabama, who had laced a wedding feast with oleander, sending an entire family into convulsions, though he had been caught and hanged for it. These stories existed in the shadows of plantation life, spoken of only in the most trusted company, a dark folklore of resistance. But Lydia had never imagined herself capable of such an act. She had always been the obedient one, the careful one, the one who survived by making herself useful and invisible. Her mother had taught her that survival meant accommodation, meant swallowing rage and presenting a face of docility. "They can take everything from you," her mother had said, "but they can't take what you keep locked inside. That belongs to you alone." So Lydia had built an interior fortress, a private self that existed beyond the reach of the Hargroves, and she had endured. But standing in that pantry with arsenic in her hand, she realized that endurance had its limits. There came a point where survival itself became a form of death, where the cost of continuing exceeded the risk of resistance. She had reached that point. The war had changed nothing for her. The Emancipation Proclamation might as well have been written in a foreign language, for all the difference it made at Magnolia Ridge. She was still trapped, still owned in every way that mattered, still subject to Caroline's violence and Edmund's exploitation. Lydia uncorked the bottle, the chemical smell sharp and acrid, burning the inside of her nose. Her hands were steady as she measured out the white powder onto a small square of parchment paper, folding it carefully. She had no precise knowledge of dosages, no scientific understanding of how much would be needed to achieve her purpose. She simply took what felt significant, what looked like it might dissolve completely into the richness of gravy or the sweetness of pie filling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing remained even, controlled. She returned to the main kitchen, tucking the folded parchment into her apron pocket. The crown roast sat on the counter, magnificent in its preparation, the bones arranged in a perfect circle like a crown indeed. The duck glazed with orange and honey gleamed under the lamplight. 3 pies cooled on the windowsill, pecan, sweet potato, and apple, their crusts golden and flaky. Bowls of cranberry relish, cornbread dressing, and creamed collard greens waited to be reheated. Everything was almost ready for tomorrow's feast. Lydia moved through the final preparations with mechanical precision. She strained the gravy through cheesecloth, ensuring its silky smoothness, then returned it to the pot to keep warm. She checked the seasoning of each dish, tasting with a small spoon, adjusting salt and pepper and herbs with the expertise of someone who had cooked thousands of meals. And then, when everything else was perfect, She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the folded parchment. The gravy seemed like the safest choice. It would be served over the crown roast. Over the dressing, ladled generously because Caroline had specifically requested plenty of gravy. The white powder would dissolve completely in the dark, rich liquid, becoming invisible and untraceable. Lydia stood over the pot, watching the gentle simmer, steam rising in lazy spirals. She unfolded the parchment and held it over the gravy, her hand suspended in that moment of irrevocability. A memory surfaced unbidden, herself at 8 years old standing in this same kitchen with her mother, learning to make biscuits. Her mother's hands guiding hers, showing her how to work the dough just enough but not too much, how to cut the rounds with a mason jar lid, how to arrange them in the cast-iron pan so they would rise evenly. "You have a gift for this," her mother had said, smiling. "You can taste things in your mind before you make them. That's rare, child, that's special." Cooking had been the one domain where Lydia experienced something resembling pride. She was genuinely skilled, genuinely talented, able to create dishes that made even the hardened overseers grunt with appreciation. She had taken that gift and refined it over decades, learning techniques from cookbooks she read in secret, experimenting with flavors and combinations, turning the mundane ingredients available to her into small works of art. The kitchen was her kingdom, the one place where her competence was undeniable. And now, she was about to transform that gift into a weapon. Lydia tilted the parchment, and the white powder cascaded into the gravy in a silent stream. She stirred it immediately with a wooden spoon, watching it disappear into the liquid, becoming one with the rendered fat and flour and stock. She stirred for a full minute, ensuring complete dissolution, her face expressionless. When she was satisfied, she tasted the gravy again. It was perfect, its flavor complex and rich, with no hint of bitterness or chemical taint. The arsenic was invisible, undetectable, waiting. She stood there for a long moment, spoon in hand, staring at the pot. What she had just done was irrevocable. There was no calling back the poison, no undoing this choice. Tomorrow, the Hargrove family and their guests would gather around the dining table in their finest clothes, would bow their heads in prayer, thanking God for their blessings, and then they would eat. Some would survive, perhaps. Some would sicken but recover, but some would die, and their deaths would be her doing. Lydia felt nothing, no surge of satisfaction, no pang of guilt, no fear of consequences. She simply felt empty, hollowed out, as if the act of poisoning the gravy had required her to excise some essential part of herself. She was a ghost moving through the kitchen, completing her tasks with the same meticulous care she had always employed. She covered the dishes with clean cloths, banked the fire in the stove, wiped down the counters and cutting boards. She moved through the familiar routines of closing the kitchen for the night, her body performing actions her mind barely registered. It was past midnight when she finally finished. The main house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in Edmund Hargrove's study, where he often sat late drinking brandy and reviewing the plantation's failing accounts. Lydia extinguished the kitchen lamps one by one, watching the darkness claim the space. In the morning, she would return before dawn to reheat the dishes and prepare for the feast. In the morning, she would serve the meal she had poisoned. In the morning, everything would change. She walked back to her cabin through the December cold, her breath forming clouds in the air. The night was crystalline and still, the stars impossibly bright, the moon a thin crescent low on the horizon. She could hear the distant sound of singing from the quarters. Some of the workers were holding a Christmas Eve service in one of the larger cabins, their voices rising in spirituals that spoke of deliverance and Jordan's far shore. Lydia paused to listen, standing in the shadows between buildings, letting the music wash over her. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. The words carried multiple meanings, as they always did. On the surface, they spoke of biblical miracles and baptismal cleansing, but underneath, they encoded instructions for escape. Wade in the water to hide your scent from the dogs. Follow the drinking gourd north. Trust that God would provide shelter and guidance. Every spiritual was a map, every hymn a coded message. The enslaved had learned to hide their true meanings in plain sight, to speak of freedom while appearing to speak of heaven. Lydia wondered if she would sing tomorrow night, wondered if she would still be alive to sing. She had not planned beyond the act of poisoning the feast, had not thought through what would happen when people began to sicken, when suspicion inevitably turned to her, when they came looking for answers. Part of her didn't care. Part of her had already accepted that this act of resistance would likely be her last. She reached her cabin, a small structure she had shared with her mother until her death. It contained a narrow bed, a small table, a trunk that held her few possessions, and a cracked mirror hung on the wall. Lydia lit a candle and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror's fractured glass. She looked older than 28, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes holding depths of experience that no one her age should possess. She studied herself as if memorizing her own features, wondering who she would be tomorrow, whether the woman who had poisoned a Christmas feast would bear any resemblance to the obedient house servant she had been. Sleep, when it finally came, was dreamless and absolute. Lydia lay down in her clothes, too tired to undress, and fell into darkness as complete as the bottom of a well. Outside, the night wind whispered through the bare branches of the magnolia trees that gave the plantation its name, their broad leaves rustling like the pages of an enormous book. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time with their ancient precision, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding below. Christmas morning arrived with a pale winter sun, struggling through banks of grey clouds. Lydia woke before dawn, as she always did, her body conditioned to rise regardless of how little rest she had received. She dressed in her cleanest dress, a plain grey cotton that her mother had made years ago, and wrapped her hair in a clean cloth. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time, then blew out the candle and stepped into the cold morning. The kitchen was frigid when Lydia arrived, the fires having died to ash during the night. She worked quickly to rebuild them, stuffing kindling into the stove and coaxing flames from the coals she had banked the evening before. Within 20 minutes, heat began to radiate through the space, driving back the December chill. She filled the large kettles with water from the pump outside, her breath clouding in the pre-dawn darkness, then set them to boil for the dishes that would need washing throughout the day. The feast components sat exactly where she had left them, covered with their white cloths like sleeping forms. Lydia uncovered each dish methodically, inspecting for any signs of spoilage, though she knew the cold overnight temperatures would have preserved everything perfectly. The crown roast needed only to be reheated in the oven. The gravy, the poisoned gravy, would be warmed gently on the stove. The pies were ready to serve. The side dishes required only final touches, a few minutes of heat to restore their optimal serving temperature. She moved through these preparations with the same focused efficiency she brought to all her work. But beneath the surface calm, her thoughts churned like water approaching a waterfall. In a few hours, the guests would begin arriving. The Whitfield family would come in their carriage, dressed in their salvaged finery, pretending their plantation hadn't lost 3/4 of its workforce. The Beaumonts would arrive on horseback, the old patriarch still wearing his Confederate colonel's jacket despite the war's end. The Caldwells would walk over from the neighboring property, bringing their unmarried daughter, who Caroline hoped might catch the eye of Edmund's younger brother, Robert. They would gather in the parlor for pre-dinner drinks, the men discussing politics and the problem of freed slaves, the women exchanging gossip and complaints about the scarcity of good servants. Then Caroline would summon them to the dining room, where Lydia would have arranged the feast on the long mahogany table that had been in the Hargrove family for 3 generations. They would admire the presentation, would compliment Caroline's hospitality, would seat themselves in order of social precedence, and then they would eat. Lydia paused in her work, her hands resting on the counter, her eyes distant. She imagined the scene as it would unfold, the first bites taken with pleasure, the conversation flowing easily, the compliments directed toward Caroline, who would graciously accept praise for food she had never touched. Then, perhaps 30 minutes later, perhaps an hour, the first symptoms would appear. Stomach cramps, nausea. Someone would excuse themselves, claiming to feel suddenly unwell. Then another. Then the vomiting would start, violent and uncontrollable. The confusion and panic as multiple guests simultaneously fell ill. Would they suspect poison immediately, or would they assume bad food, some ingredient that had spoiled despite the cold? How long before someone thought to question Lydia, to search the kitchen for evidence? She had disposed of the arsenic bottle last night, burying it in the woods beyond the quarters, but that didn't mean they wouldn't find other ways to trace the poisoning back to her. The sound of footsteps on the back porch interrupted her thoughts. Lydia tensed, but it was only Samuel, one of the remaining field workers, who sometimes helped with heavy lifting around the main house. He was a man of about 40, grizzled and quiet, with hands like gnarled oak roots and a back marked by scars from whippings he had received years ago. "Morning, Lydia," he said, stamping his feet to shake off the cold. "Mistress sent me to help with the table setup, said you'd need the extra hands." Lydia nodded, relief flooding through her. Samuel was one of the few people on the plantation she trusted, though they rarely spoke beyond necessary exchanges. He had a wife and 3 children in the quarters, and he had stayed at Magnolia Ridge because he had nowhere else to take them. Like her, he was trapped by circumstances that offered no good alternatives. "The dining table needs to be set," she said. "The good china is in the cabinet in the butler's pantry. 12 place settings. The silver needs polishing. It's tarnished from sitting unused." Samuel nodded and set to work. They moved around each other in comfortable silence, 2 people who understood that survival often meant keeping your head down and your thoughts to yourself. Lydia wondered if Samuel suspected anything unusual about today's preparations. Wondered if he had noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands occasionally trembled when she thought no one was watching. But he gave no sign of curiosity, simply completed his tasks with methodical care. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen had transformed into organized chaos. Every surface held a dish in various stages of preparation. The crown roast was in the oven, its juices sizzling. The gravy simmered on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. Lydia moved between stations, tasting, adjusting, ensuring everything met the exacting standards Caroline would demand. She had to remind herself that the quality of the food still mattered, perhaps mattered more now than ever. If the feast was anything less than perfect, suspicion might fall on her immediately when people began to sicken. Caroline appeared at 9 o'clock, already dressed in her green silk gown, her hair elaborately arranged. She swept through the kitchen like a general inspecting troops before battle, her critical eye examining every detail. She tasted the gravy, the poisoned gravy, and pronounced it acceptable. She inspected the crown roast through the oven's glass door and nodded with satisfaction. She ran her finger along the edge of a serving platter, checking for dust, and found none. "The guests will begin arriving at 11, Caroline announced. "Dinner will be served promptly at noon. I expect everything to be ready on time, presented beautifully and served efficiently. You will remain in the kitchen except when bringing out dishes or clearing plates. I do not want the guests disturbed by your presence more than necessary." "Yes, mistress," Lydia said, her voice neutral, her face carefully blank. Caroline studied her for a moment, and Lydia felt the weight of that gaze, searching for any hint of the rebellion brewing beneath her obedient exterior. But whatever Caroline saw, or failed to see, satisfied her. She turned and left the kitchen in another rustle of silk, leaving behind instructions for Samuel to arrange the chairs and ensure the fireplace in the dining room was properly stoked. If this story of hidden resistance is resonating with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These untold histories connect us across continents and generations. Lydia stood alone in the kitchen after they left, surrounded by the feast she had created. The morning sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the heated air. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. In 3 hours, the first course would be served. In 3 hours, the consequences of her choice would begin to unfold. She thought about running. She could slip out the back door right now, could take the path through the woods that led to the main road, could simply walk away and never look back. The feast would still be served. Samuel could manage the basics of bringing out dishes, and Caroline would be so distracted by her guests that she might not notice Lydia's absence until it was too late. But where would she go? The roads were dangerous for a black woman traveling alone, especially one fleeing from a plantation where people were about to die mysteriously. No, running would only confirm her guilt. Better to stay, to play out the role of obedient servant, to act surprised and horrified when the poisoning revealed itself. Better to be present and accounted for, to have witnesses to her ignorance. It was a gamble, but everything now was a gamble. The morning crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Lydia completed her final preparations, arranging garnishes on platters, ensuring each dish was ready to be served at the perfect temperature. She heard the sounds of the main house coming alive, footsteps overhead, doors opening and closing, the murmur of voices as the Hargrove family dressed and prepared to receive their guests. Edmund's booming laugh echoed through the walls, false and hearty, the laugh of a man trying to convince himself that his world hadn't collapsed. At 11 o'clock precisely, the first carriage arrived. Lydia heard the crunch of wheels on gravel, the whinny of horses, the excited greetings as Caroline welcomed the Whitfield family. More arrivals followed in quick succession, the thunder of hoofbeats announcing the Beaumonts, the lighter footfalls of the Caldwells walking up from their property. Voices filled the parlor, bright and artificial, everyone performing the elaborate theater of normalcy. Lydia prepared the serving trays, arranging everything according to the strict protocols Caroline had drilled into her. First would come the appetizers, deviled eggs and pickled vegetables, and thin slices of ham on cornbread rounds. Then the soup, a creamy butternut squash bisque. Then the main course with the crown roast as the centerpiece, surrounded by all the side dishes, and of course generous servings of gravy. Finally, the desserts and coffee. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 11:45. "They're ready for the first course," he said quietly. Lydia handed him the tray of appetizers, her hands steady. "Take these to the dining room. Set them on the sideboard. Caroline will direct from there." She watched him disappear through the door, then turned back to her preparations. The soup was ready, ladled into the finest porcelain bowls, each one garnished with a small swirl of cream and a sprinkle of toasted pumpkin seeds. The crown roast rested on its platter, magnificent and deadly. The gravy boat was filled and waiting, a silver vessel that gleamed in the lamplight. Through the closed door, Lydia could hear the sounds of the gathering, laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs as people settled themselves at the table. She imagined them in their finery, seated in order of precedence, their faces flushed with the warmth of the fire and the glow of pre-dinner drinks. They would be talking about the usual topics: the incompetence of the federal government, the injustice of Reconstruction, the difficulty of managing free labor. They would congratulate themselves on their resilience, on their determination to preserve their way of life despite the war's outcome. They had no idea what was coming. At precisely noon, Caroline rang the small silver bell that signaled the transition from appetizers to the main meal. Samuel returned to the kitchen, his face unreadable, and began loading the serving trays with the soup bowls. Lydia watched him carry them through the door, heard the appreciative murmurs from the dining room as the guests encountered the first course. She stood at the stove, her hand resting on the handle of the pot containing the gravy, feeling its warmth radiate through the iron. Minutes passed like hours. Lydia heard the muffled sounds of eating, the occasional burst of laughter, the rise and fall of conversation. Samuel returned with the empty soup bowls, stacking them efficiently beside the washing basin. He gave Lydia a brief nod. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The guests were pleased. Caroline was in her element, playing the gracious hostess, directing the meal with theatrical precision. "They're ready for the main course," Samuel said, his voice low. This was the moment. Lydia began arranging the platters, the crown roast in the center, surrounded by the sweet potato casserole, the cornbread dressing, the creamed collards, the cranberry relish. She placed the gravy boat on the tray last, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight. Her hands were steady as she handed the first laden tray to Samuel, then prepared a second with additional side dishes. She followed him through the door into the dining room, carrying her tray, keeping her eyes lowered in the expected posture of servility. The room was warm and bright, the fireplace crackling with split oak, the chandelier casting honeyed light across the long mahogany table. 12 faces turned briefly toward her as she entered. The Hargroves, the Whitfields, the Beaumonts, the Caldwells, all of them dressed in their salvaged best, all of them performing wealth they no longer possessed. Lydia set her tray on the sideboard and began transferring dishes to the table under Caroline's sharp-eyed supervision. The crown roast occupied the place of honor at the center, its bones arranged in a perfect circle, the meat glistening with its glaze. Edmund Hargrove stood to carve it, making a show of his role as patriarch and provider, his knife glinting as he cut thick slices and distributed them to plates. The gravy boat made its way around the table, each guest ladling the rich dark liquid over their meat and dressing, over their vegetables, generous portions, because Caroline had insisted there should be plenty. Lydia retreated to her position against the wall, hands clasped in front of her, face carefully neutral. She watched the first bites being taken, watched forks rising to mouths, watched the expressions of pleasure as people tasted the food she had prepared. Colonel Beaumont closed his eyes as he chewed a piece of the crown roast, murmuring appreciation. Mrs. Whitfield complimented Caroline on the gravy, declaring it the finest she had ever tasted. The younger Caldwell girl giggled at something Robert Hargrove said, her cheeks pink with youth and wine. They ate with the unconscious entitlement of people who had never questioned their right to abundance. They ate while in the quarters beyond the main house, families who had worked these fields for generations scraped together meager meals from cornmeal and scraps. They ate while across the south, newly freed people starved because no one would hire them, and no land had been redistributed. They ate while congratulating themselves on their virtue, their Christianity, their superiority. Lydia felt nothing as she watched them. No satisfaction, no guilt, no fear. She had moved beyond emotion into a strange state of detachment, as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. She noted details with clinical precision, the way Edmund's hand shook slightly as he raised his wineglass, betraying the financial stress he tried to hide, the forced brightness in Caroline's laugh covering desperation, the way the guests avoided certain topics, dancing around the uncomfortable realities of their reduced circumstances. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The conversation flowed easily, lubricated by wine and the comfort of familiar company. Plates were emptied and refilled. The gravy boat made a second circuit around the table, Colonel Beaumont declaring he could not resist another helping, despite his wife's protests about his waistline. Someone proposed a toast to the endurance of Southern hospitality, and glasses clinked in agreement. Then Edmund Hargrove paused mid-sentence, his hand moving to his stomach. His face had gone slightly pale, a sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tight. "I seem to have developed a sudden discomfort." Caroline turned to him, concern flickering across her face. "Edmund, are you unwell?" "Just a bit of indigestion, I'm sure," he replied, though his hand pressed harder against his abdomen. "Perhaps I ate too quickly." But before Caroline could respond, Mrs. Whitfield made a small sound of distress, her own hand moving to her stomach. Her husband looked at her sharply. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "I don't know," she whispered, her face draining of color. "I feel quite ill suddenly." The conversation around the table faltered, died. Other guests began shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, faces showing the first signs of distress. The younger Caldwell girl stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to—" she began, then clapped a hand over her mouth and rushed from the room. Panic rippled through the gathering like wind across water. Within moments, half the guests were on their feet, some rushing for doors, others doubled over in their chairs. Edmund Hargrove had gone grey, sweat now pouring down his face. "What is happening?" he gasped. "What's wrong with the food?" Caroline's eyes, wide with confusion and growing horror, swept across the chaos of her ruined feast. Then they locked on Lydia, still standing against the wall, her face carefully blank. Something cold and terrible passed between them in that moment. Recognition, suspicion, the dawning awareness of betrayal. "You," Caroline whispered, her voice cutting through the groans and chaos. "What did you do?" Lydia said nothing. She simply stood there, meeting Caroline's gaze with steady eyes, no longer performing the downcast submission expected of her. The silence between them was profound, despite the surrounding chaos, heavy with the weight of 28 years of accumulated grievances. "What did you do?" Caroline screamed, lunging toward Lydia, but her own stomach cramped violently, and she staggered, catching herself against the table. Edmund tried to stand, to reach for Lydia, but his legs wouldn't support him and he collapsed back into his chair. The dining room had descended into pandemonium. Guests stumbled toward doors, seeking bathrooms, seeking fresh air, seeking any relief from the violent cramping and nausea that had seized them. Colonel Beaumont was on his knees beside the fireplace, vomiting into the hearth. Mrs. Whitfield had fainted in her chair, her husband desperately trying to revive her, while fighting his own symptoms. The sounds of retching came from multiple directions, from the hallway where guests had fled, from behind closed doors. Samuel had appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. He looked at Lydia, and in that look she saw understanding flash across his face. He knew. Somehow, he knew what she had done, but instead of condemnation, she saw something else in his expression, a complex mixture of fear and what might have been grim approval. "Get the doctor," Edmund gasped, his voice barely audible. "Samuel, ride for Dr. Mitchell. Tell him we've been poisoned." Samuel hesitated for the briefest moment, his eyes still on Lydia. Then he nodded and disappeared. Lydia heard his footsteps running through the house, heard the back door slam, heard the thunder of hoofbeats as he galloped away. The doctor lived 5 miles distant. It would take Samuel at least 20 minutes to reach him, another 20 or more for them to return. By then, the poison would have done much of its work. Caroline had slumped in her chair, her carefully arranged hair coming loose, her green silk dress stained with vomit. She looked at Lydia with eyes that held hatred and incomprehension in equal measure. "Why?" she managed to whisper through the pain. "We kept you, we gave you a home. Why would you do this?" Lydia finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the chaos. "You never gave me anything. You took my mother, my brother, my entire life. You took and called it charity. We owned you." Caroline spat, then gasped as another wave of pain seized her. "That was our right, "No one has that right," Lydia said simply. "No one ever did." She turned and walked from the dining room, leaving behind the destruction she had wrought. As she moved through the house toward the kitchen, she could hear the sounds of suffering echoing through the halls, groaning, crying, the violent sounds of bodies rejecting poison. She felt detached from it all, as if she were moving through a dream, her actions predetermined by forces beyond her control. In the kitchen, she paused. The remaining dishes sat on the counters, the pies, the coffee service, the desserts that would never be served. She had spent 3 days preparing this feast, had poured her skill and knowledge into every dish, and now it would be remembered only as the meal that killed, or nearly killed, some of the most prominent families in Harrison County. Lydia removed her apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the counter. She untied the cloth from her hair, shaking her head so her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She had lived 28 years as an enslaved woman, and in the past 24 hours, she had transformed herself into something else entirely. She didn't yet know what that something was, but she knew she could never go back to being who she had been. Lydia walked out of the main house through the back door, her footsteps steady on the wooden porch steps. The December afternoon was cold and clear, the sun hanging low in a cloudless sky, indifferent to the chaos unfolding inside the plantation house. Behind her, she could still hear the sounds of suffering, the groans, the weeping, the frantic calls for help that no one could provide. But she didn't look back. She had committed herself to this path the moment she poured poison into the gravy, and there was no point in hesitation now. She walked toward the quarters, past the silent cotton gin, past the empty fields where brown stalks stood in withered rows, awaiting spring planting that might never come. Other workers emerged from their cabins as she approached, drawn by some instinct that told them something significant was happening. They stood in doorways and gathered in small clusters, watching her progress with wary eyes. Old Thomas, who had worked the Magnolia Ridge fields for 50 years, stepped forward as Lydia approached. He was a man diminished by age and hard labor, his back permanently bent, his hands gnarled like old rope. But his eyes were sharp, and they studied Lydia with an intensity that suggested he understood more than he was willing to say aloud. "What's happening up at the big house?" he asked quietly. "We heard the screaming." Lydia met his gaze directly. "They're sick, all of them. The Christmas feast didn't agree with them." A heavy silence fell over the gathered workers. Lydia could see the understanding ripple through the group, the quick exchanges of glances, the subtle shifts in posture. They knew, or suspected, or perhaps they had always known that one day someone would reach the breaking point and resistance would take a form more direct than stolen moments or slowdowns or subtle sabotage. "Samuel rode for the doctor," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, 20 minutes ago." "And what are you going to do, girl?" It was the question Lydia had been asking herself since she walked out of the kitchen. She could run, try to make it to one of the nearby towns, perhaps find refuge with the Freedmen's Bureau if they would believe her story. She could hide in the woods until dark, then slip away under cover of night. She could throw herself on the mercy of whatever justice system existed in post-war Texas, though she had no illusions about what justice meant for a black woman who had poisoned white people. Or she could stay, could face whatever consequences emerged from this day, with her head held high, refusing to perform the shame and regret they would expect from her, could use whatever platform a trial might provide to speak truths that were usually silenced. Before she could answer Thomas, the sound of hoofbeats announced Samuel's return with Dr. Mitchell. The doctor was a thin, severe man in his 60s who had served as a Confederate surgeon during the war. He dismounted with practiced efficiency and hurried into the main house, his medical bag in hand. Samuel followed more slowly, leading both horses toward the stable. Lydia watched them disappear into the house. She imagined the scene the doctor would encounter, the dining room transformed into a field hospital, bodies sprawled in chairs and on the floor, the stench of vomit and fear thick in the air. She imagined him examining the guests, taking pulses, checking pupils, his mind racing through possible diagnoses. How long before he concluded it was poison? How long before someone, probably Caroline, pointed him toward Lydia as the obvious suspect? Not long at all, as it turned out. Within 10 minutes, the doctor emerged from the house and strode directly toward the quarters, his face set in grim lines. Samuel walked beside him, and behind them came 2 of the Beaumont sons, both young men who had fought in the war and returned home with the casual violence of soldiers still looking for enemies to fight. The workers scattered as the doctor approached, melting back into their cabins, wanting no part of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Only Thomas remained, standing a few feet from Lydia, his presence a silent statement of solidarity or perhaps witness. Dr. Mitchell stopped a few paces from Lydia, his eyes moving over her with clinical assessment. "Are you the one called Lydia? The cook?" "I am. Mistress Hargrove claims you poisoned the Christmas dinner. Is this true?" Lydia had imagined this moment would be more dramatic, more emotionally charged. Instead, it felt oddly mundane, like any other transaction of power between white and black in the post-war South. She could lie, claim ignorance, suggest the food had spoiled somehow, perform the expected role of the confused and innocent servant. But what would be the point? They would search the kitchen, would eventually find evidence or create it, would convict her regardless of what she said. "Yes," she said simply, "it's true." A ripple of shock passed through the group. Even Thomas made a small sound, though whether of surprise or confirmation, Lydia couldn't tell. The Beaumont sons moved forward aggressively, but the doctor held up a hand to stop them. "Why?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath the severity. "Why would you do such a thing?" Lydia looked at him, at this man who had owned slaves himself until 7 months ago, who had fought to preserve a system built on human bondage, who even now saw nothing wrong with the fundamental arrangement of their society. How could she explain to someone like him the accumulated weight of injustice, the breaking point that comes when endurance itself becomes unbearable? "Because I could," she said finally, "because for the first time in my life, I had the power to say no, to resist, to make them feel even a fraction of the suffering they've inflicted. They gave you a home, employment. They gave me nothing," Lydia interrupted, her voice sharp. "They stole my life and called it ownership. They worked my mother to death and called it natural. They sold my brother like livestock and called it property rights. There is no gift in any of that, doctor, only theft." The Beaumont sons surged forward again, and this time the doctor didn't stop them. They grabbed Lydia by the arms, their grips bruising, their faces twisted with rage. "You poisoned my father," one of them hissed. "How you tried to murder our entire family." "Your father will survive," the doctor said, his voice clinical. "Most of them will. The dosage was significant but not immediately lethal. With proper care and time, they should recover, though it will be several days of considerable discomfort." Lydia felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment at this news. She had not known whether she wanted them to die or simply to suffer. Now the choice had been made for her. They would live, but they would carry the memory of this Christmas feast for the rest of their days. "What do we do with her?" one of the Beaumont sons asked. The doctor studied Lydia for a long moment. "The law will handle this. We need to send for the sheriff. In the meantime, she'll need to be secured. Is there a root cellar or storage building that can be locked?" "The smokehouse," Samuel said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken since returning with the doctor. "It has a heavy door and a lock." They dragged Lydia across the yard toward the smokehouse, a small wooden building that stood apart from the other structures. Inside, it smelled of old smoke and cured meat, the walls black with decades of use. They pushed her inside roughly, and she stumbled but caught herself against the wall. The door slammed shut, and she heard the metallic scrape of a key turning in the lock. Darkness enveloped her, broken only by thin strips of light that leaked through gaps in the wooden walls. Lydia stood still, letting her eyes adjust, her breathing steady. She had been locked in dark places before, punishment rooms, storage cellars, anywhere that served to break the spirit of an enslaved person who had shown too much independence. But this was different. This time, she had chosen the path that led to this confinement. This time, the darkness held no shame. She lowered herself to the dirt floor, her back against the wall, and waited. Outside, she could hear muffled voices, footsteps, the general commotion of crisis. Someone rode off, probably to fetch the sheriff from the county seat, a journey that would take several hours round trip. The winter afternoon faded toward evening, the strips of light dimming gradually, until full darkness claimed the smokehouse. Lydia sat in that darkness and thought about her mother, who had died without ever knowing freedom. She thought about her brother, whose face she could barely remember, who had been 10 years old the last time she saw him. She thought about all the people who had lived and died in bondage on this plantation, their names forgotten, their stories erased, their suffering dismissed as the natural order of things. If this story of resistance and reckoning has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These voices from history deserve to echo across the world. Your engagement helps ensure these forgotten stories continue to be told. Hours passed. Lydia dozed intermittently, her body exhausted from 3 days of cooking and the emotional toll of what she had done. She woke to the sound of horses and voices. The sheriff had arrived. She heard the smokehouse door being unlocked and then lantern light flooded in, blinding her momentarily. Sheriff Coleman was a heavy-set man with a thick grey beard and eyes that had seen too much violence to be shocked by much of anything anymore. He looked down at Lydia with an expression that might have been pity or might have been contempt. It was difficult to tell in the uncertain light. "On your feet," he said, not unkindly. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." Lydia stood, her legs stiff from sitting on the cold ground. They bound her wrists with rope and led her outside, where a wagon waited. The night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across the sky like salt spilled on black cloth. Workers had gathered again, silent witnesses to her removal. She saw Thomas standing at the edge of the crowd, his face solemn. She saw Samuel, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding something that might have been respect. They helped her into the back of the wagon, and the sheriff climbed onto the driver's seat. As they pulled away from Magnolia Ridge, Lydia looked back at the plantation that had been her entire world. The main house glowed with lamplight, every window illuminated as if for a celebration rather than a crisis. The quarters were mostly dark, just a few scattered lights marking the cabins where families huddled against the cold. She wondered if she would ever see this place again, wondered what her trial would look like. What verdict an all-white jury would render against a black woman who had poisoned prominent white families. The outcome seemed predetermined. At best, decades in prison. At worst, execution. There was no scenario in which she walked free. But as the wagon carried her away through the December night, Lydia felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not regret, not fear, but a strange sense of completion. She had spent 28 years being acted upon, being owned, being controlled. For one brief moment, from the time she poured poison into that gravy until this moment, she had been the actor, the one who made choices and shaped outcomes. The trial came 6 weeks later, held in the Harrison County Courthouse in a frigid January that saw ice coating the windows and snow dusting the ground. Lydia stood before the judge in the same grey dress she had worn on Christmas Day, her hands shackled, her face composed. The courtroom was packed with spectators, white families who had known the Hargroves, reporters from newspapers as far away as Houston and New Orleans, curious townspeople drawn by the sensational nature of the case. The prosecution presented its evidence with clinical efficiency. The doctor testified about the symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. Caroline Hargrove took the stand and described Lydia's insolent behavior in the days before Christmas, the way she had looked at her mistress with hatred in her eyes. The empty space where the arsenic bottle had been kept was documented. Witnesses described Lydia's confession, her refusal to show remorse. Lydia's defense was perfunctory. A young lawyer appointed by the court who seemed more interested in concluding the proceedings quickly than in mounting any serious challenge to the charges. He made a brief argument about the psychological effects of slavery, about diminished capacity due to years of abuse, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty on all counts. Sentenced to 20 years hard labor at the state prison in Huntsville. As the judge pronounced sentence, Lydia stood silent and still. She didn't weep or protest or beg for mercy. She simply accepted the judgment, as she had accepted everything else in her life, with dignity intact, refusing to perform the expected role of the repentant criminal. But before they led her from the courtroom, she asked to make a statement. The judge, perhaps curious about what this woman who had poisoned a Christmas feast might say, granted permission. Lydia stood at the defendant's table and looked out at the crowd of white faces staring back at her. She thought about all the words that had been silenced over the centuries of slavery, all the testimonies that had never been heard, all the truths that had been deliberately erased. "I am guilty of poisoning the Hargrove family's Christmas feast," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I did it knowingly and deliberately, but I am not guilty of the greater crime, the crime of enslaving human beings, of treating people as property, of building wealth on the backs of stolen lives. That crime belongs to them and to all of you who participated in it, or benefited from it, or looked away while it happened." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but the judge allowed her to continue. "I spent 28 years being owned, 28 years watching my mother work herself to death, 28 years waiting for the freedom that was always promised but never delivered. And when freedom finally came, it changed nothing. We were still trapped, still exploited, still treated as less than human. So yes, I poisoned their feast. I claim that act. I own it. It was the only power I ever had, and I used it." The judge banged his gavel, declaring her statement concluded, and the bailiffs moved to escort her from the courtroom. But as they led her away, Lydia heard something unexpected, a single voice from the gallery calling out, "Amen," then another. Then more, a chorus of voices from the segregated section where black spectators had been forced to sit. They were claiming her act, witnessing her resistance, refusing to let it be dismissed as simple criminality. Lydia was transported to Huntsville prison on a freezing February morning. She would serve 15 years of her sentence before being released in 1881, her health broken, but her spirit somehow intact. She lived another 12 years after her release, working as a laundress in Houston, never returning to Harrison County or Magnolia Ridge. The Hargrove family never fully recovered from the scandal. Caroline died 3 years after the poisoning, her health permanently damaged by the arsenic, and perhaps by the shame of having been outwitted by someone she had considered inferior. Edmund lost the plantation to creditors in 1870 and died in poverty in 1875. Magnolia Ridge changed hands several times before being abandoned completely, its fields returning to wilderness, its grand house eventually collapsing into ruin. But the story of Lydia's resistance lived on, passed down through generations of black families in East Texas. It became legend, embellished and transformed over the decades until the specific details blurred, but the essential truth remained that an enslaved woman had claimed her power, had struck back against her oppressors, had refused to accept the role assigned to her by a brutal system. History would record the Christmas of 1865 at Magnolia Ridge as a crime, a tragedy, an act of vengeance by an unstable woman driven mad by slavery. But those who understood what it meant to live under the weight of bondage, who carried in their bones the accumulated trauma of generations, they told a different story. They told of a woman named Lydia, who had served a silent Christmas feast, who had prepared a reckoning disguised as hospitality, who had reminded her oppressors that even the most powerless could find ways to resist. Her name, forgotten by official histories, lived on in the whispered tales of resistance that sustained communities through the long, hard years of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And perhaps that is its own form of justice, to be remembered not by those who condemned her, but by those who understood why she did what she did, who saw in her act not madness, but a terrible, necessary assertion of human dignity. The smokehouse where they held her that Christmas night still stands, or stood until recently, a leaning relic on land that has changed hands dozens of times. And sometimes, on cold December evenings when the light falls just right, you can almost smell the phantom scent of that poisoned feast. Rich gravy and roasted meat, celebration turned to suffering, the bitter taste of resistance served on fine china. This concludes the story of Lydia and the silent Christmas feast of 1865. Thank you for watching this chapter of Hidden History. If these forgotten stories resonate with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this with others who need to hear these voices from the past. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what other untold stories you'd like us to explore. Remember, history belongs to those who tell it, and these stories deserve to be told.